Welcome, Sherrie.
Hello, hello.
So this is Sherrie Miller, and she was one of the participants in the Finders course that just completed. And we're going to be asking her some questions, basically, about her experience and the course in general. So let me start by just asking you, what changed for you before and after? And we'll get into that in different ways. But specifically, who would you say you were, or what would you say you were like to be around before the course versus after?
I was a very angry person, very negative, very much wanting to be left alone by everyone and everything, but in a very negative sort of way. I didn't find a lot of pleasure in anything I did. I didn't see really a lot of good about my life in general. It was difficult for me to have conversations with family members and people who should have been important in my life. I just really was angry with every day.
I have to say, you put on a good face when you first were in the early part of the course.
Well, and I think possibly most people didn't realize that. It was all other than when I would become angry at very simple things and lash out usually at people I had no business lashing out at. Everything was very much internalized. So I was turning it all back in on myself more than anything else.
If that's the before, what's the after?
All of that has fallen away. I have a very, very deep sense of happiness, of well-being. I'm not angry anymore. I truly, going through all the different exercises, little by little, that chipped away. And until finally I was able to think about various situations that had been piling one on the other over the years, and they just didn't have any power over me anymore. I released it all, and I just feel totally contented with life now. So for me, there was a very abrupt change internally, and it feels really great.
I think the amazing thing is that was very true for everybody, really, that went through the course. So you're not alone. It's not just a for me thing there.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask you before and after, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, stress, anxiety, well-being, but I feel like you just answered that all so well.
Absolutely, yes. 0 to 10.
What do you think, what have the noticeable benefits been for you?
My interactions with some of the people who I think maybe engendered, or I allowed to engender some of the anger, have totally changed. I'm able to have conversations. I'm able to feel love and empathy to a much greater degree, and to actually begin rebuilding some relationships, which again has made so much difference in my being able to go through each day. That's been one of the benefits. Another is a feeling of calmness most of the time. Now, there are still some things that annoy me, but they don't have the hold over me that they once did. I'm able to, think about it quickly and it's gone. I think one of the things also that I don't have the noise in my head. It's like I'm not thinking 3 weeks in advance. I'm not thinking about everything I have to do to get ready for the next day, or later in the day even. It's allowed me just to let things happen and not to worry and get upset about what may or may not happen in the future. So those have been the biggest benefits.
Can you talk a little bit more? I'm curious about the relationship angle and the healing relationships angle. I think this is interesting because it's one of the things that came up, I feel like, for a lot of people.
Okay. Well, and I'll talk about the relationship that is the closest to me at the moment, and it's one where I am the primary caregiver for my mother at this point, and have been for about the last 12 years.
Wow.
She lives with me, and through that, I think as other things in my life began to become more stressful, actually, that was quite a stressor in my life, is just having a parent who often acts like a 2-year-old, who is still your parent. And I began to let a lot of other situations that were going in a bad way in my life, I began to blame her for all of these things. I blamed her for having to take days off of work to take her to a doctor's appointment. I blamed her for breaking up my marriage. I blamed her for all kinds of things that, realizing now, it was totally ridiculous. So my mother and I could not have a conversation. I was so angry at her that I almost could not be in the same room. It had gotten to the point. And she didn't deserve that. She certainly, she is a very wonderful woman. She has a lot of illness, and she's at the point in her life that she does need someone to care for her. She doesn't deserve to be living with someone who is just angry at her and can't say 2 good words to her. So over the last, I would say, at least 2 months, when she says something to me now, I don't react in a negative way. I look at her and I think, there's a whole new sense of compassion and love, and I am able to respond to her on a level and on a way, whether it's agreement or whether it's, we'll look into that, we'll take care of that. I'll give you an example. When I came in last night, there was a leak in the faucet in her bathroom, and there was water that had come out and gotten all over the floor. And she was so upset. She just kept saying, the only thing she could say was, I don't know where the water's coming from. I don't know where the water's coming from. So I went in and I said, all right, you sit down. I'm going to turn the water off and go get, we'll take care of it. Now, 3 months ago, I would have raged at her when she started, because I would have been so upset with her panic level. But everything she said, I just was, it wasn't a problem. We took care of it, and I was able to reduce her panic, and felt like we both came out a little closer in that, because I think, again, she's used to me being the parent now and being a very angry parent. So I was able just to be very calm and patient with her, and fix things and not get her any more upset than she already was. So that's just one small example that comes to mind, whereas I would have been yelling and screaming and acting just as much of a 2-year-old as she was at some times. But so I feel like, and I feel very good about the fact that we're actually beginning to develop back a relationship. Because as I said, you know, she's been on this earth almost 89 years and cared for me the best she could, and she doesn't deserve to have stress and anxiety at the level I was causing her to have. So that's just one good thing.
Well, thank you very much for being so open with such personal things. I really appreciate that, and I'm sure that everybody does that listens to this as well. One of the things that I think we've learned recently is sort of the importance of having that connection, the importance of being able to talk about these everyday life events and how things have changed around them, and things that we normally don't just talk about sort of with strangers.
Right.
But the examples that they provide for people can be so powerful in terms of this realization that there's this whole other way to experience the world and to be in the world.
I think on one level, you know, all the training I had as a school psychologist in talking, you know, you don't share your personal things so easily and quickly. So I may be oversharing a little much, but it's okay.
I think there's a degree of openness actually that comes along with this. You know, just part of the shift. I think that there's less of a need to fear. There's less of a sense that there's a shame, you know, that needs to be around our normal human experiences. You know, what do you think about that?
I agree. I think that is one thing that I have seen, that, you know, I'm not as afraid to talk about personal things as I have pretty much been most of my life. Whether it was through training as a psychologist or not, I just, you know, my thoughts were mine, and I didn't do a lot of sharing with those things. So, but I don't have that fear. You know, everyone else goes through the same kinds of things, so we have no need to fear discussing those things openly, because it can only help us all.
Just out of curiosity, I mean, we talk about all of these changes. Do you think that other people have seen changes in you over this period? Is it just an internal thing? Are you just feeling differently yourself, or have others noticed sort of a difference in your behavior or attitude, or I don't know, receptivity or whatever?
Some of my coworkers definitely noticed that I wasn't as sarcastic, and I've always been a little bit of a smart ass, to speak. Don't know if I can say that. But I'm not as sarcastic. It's not that, you know, I don't still think things are relatively funny, but I don't feel the need to try to belittle or just to make some sort of smart comment for every situation like I did. So some of my coworkers definitely noticed that, you know, I wasn't always making negative comments or being really cute about situations that had bothered me in the past. So I think there was that noticeable difference.
Right on. Do you think, I assume, I mean, your mom must have noticed something.
She's not someone who would say a lot about any kind of changes. I usually hear it secondhand from my brother when he's talking, or she's been talking to him, and he has said that, you know, she says things are going pretty well. So I suppose she has seen a difference.
That seems like such a standard family dynamic. It's always
Yeah,
like coming through the siblings. I've heard that so many times.
absolutely. um, but I think you're right. She has noticed that I'm not evil like I was. So
What other stuff did you sort of try to shift these negative emotional patterns or negative outlooks or whatever else? Or maybe not so much detailing those, you don't really have to get into those. But I'm just curious, what do you think was different about this set of methods and practices and training than those other things?
I think really how you were able to give us a set of activities. You know, every week we were starting off with being more positive and being more grateful, and every week we were adding on to that so that there was a continuing cumulative effect, and that the different meditations, the different activities all seem to come together in a way that the effects were multiplied. Not only that, but changing different patterns of thinking, allowing our brains to direct themselves in a new way. All those things together, you know, they made such good sense cognitively. So to the extent that, you know, for me it was just, hey, this is great. It's easy to buy into for me. It makes sense from an intellectual standpoint. There are activities that, you know, all I have to do is just do the activities and continue to grow in positive feelings. And again, because, you know, we continued to work, we were together every week. I really think that everything that we did in the first class was so important to me in being able to build the background and to build, you know, the change in mental connections. Things I'd done in the past were fairly short term. You know, like everyone else, I may have got an initial jolt, but then life came back. And when life came back, you know, everything I had tried before started going by the wayside. With the benefits, the things we've done through the course, I haven't felt a difficulty in continuing with the different practices, the different ways of thinking. They're almost ingrained now. Well, I'll say more than almost, they are ingrained. To the extent that it is just, you know, at least every waking moment, and I'm sure beyond that, you know, the changes are taking place. And I don't have to go back and think differently now or redo things. So that's maybe a little longer answer than you wanted there. But
No, that's great. The more detail, the better, I think. You know, it's interesting because as I listen to you talking about that, it really seems like there's this set of very sort of standard things that we're likely to hear from a positive psychology standpoint today, right? Gratitude, for instance, and forgiveness and things like that. And of course, that first class definitely incorporated a number of the gold standard things from positive psychology, and it was designed to produce a positive shift in the mind, sort of the way traditional psychology would view it. But I think the fascinating thing about the course for me was the way it seemed to produce a much more deep, you know, long-lasting, fundamental, if you will, shift in just one's way of perceiving and being in the world, really. And it goes, I mean, those changes were so far beyond what I think can even be imagined or conceptualized inside of the positive psychology world right now. Do you have a, was there a moment for you where you really perceived that more deep and more fundamental shift?
I think the changes for me began when we were talking about looking at the perfection of things in life, being able to really focus on for me it was more things in nature, but I can still look around and see how there is some perfection in a daily task, and I know that's something that will be discussed as the course goes along. But being able to really think about, for example, the beauty of nature, which I've always enjoyed being outdoors and backpacking, and that really resonated with me, was to just be able to get to the perfect nature of things I see outside. So that began, I believe, to make some shift. And then when we did our exercise in asking the question, who am I? And through that activity, I have to say I suddenly saw the things around me with great clarity. It was almost like another dimension was added to, I was sitting in the room I'm in now, and as I looked around, it was amazing how much colors jumped out at me, how close things seemed to me. And then for weeks after that, I would walk outside and the trees were all just brilliant and vibrant and alive. And I think that was where I saw the big shift.
That's interesting. That's really cool. Yeah, those couple of weeks of exercises there. Well, everything in there is so powerful, and it's so powerful, and it's so carefully constructed, basically, and done in certain orders and in certain ways and stuff like that. But I think personally, I have some expectation that for certain types of people, different weeks will have different levels of impact, and the impact that comes from that is really amazing. It was actually fascinating, just for anybody watching this or everybody watching this. So that was actually an exercise. The second thing that Sherrie mentioned was actually an exercise that we did in class. And what was really cool about that is that we were able to actually see that transition taking place, really sort of see that moment where that shift occurred, and there was a completely different way of perceiving the world that sort of snapped in. Let me ask, have you noticed, what have you noticed since then? Have you noticed that things have continued to intensify, or have you noticed that things have become sort of increasingly a new normal, or what's happened since then?
I believe I'm beginning to have these things become more the new normal, but at the same time, at least once a day, I will look toward the sky, for example, and just the clouds, the colors. I'm able to get right back into that feeling of perfection, and it's like a tingle almost all through my body when I start thinking about the beauty around me and the perfection. And after that experience, there's still that great feeling of well-being and that all is right and everything in my life is exactly as it should be. So I can see some of the things becoming the new norm, but at the same time, I'm still experiencing the same kinds of feelings for many things that I see on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The brain does, you know, essentially make new experiences, no matter how incredible they are, more normal over time. And I think it's kind of surprising to people initially. But that even happens in the case of this. I mean, obviously the new normal that you settle into isn't anything like the previous normal, as we heard you describe at the beginning. But nonetheless, that shift, it really does occur. It doesn't mean that you can't still, you know, access those things in sort of exceptional ways or focus on them and have them re-intensify in the case of like sensory phenomena like that or whatever. You know, I know people who have experienced this for decades, and it's funny because they say, you know, I remember I was miserable before it, but I don't really remember much specifically about that other than this vague memory that I was miserable. I don't really remember what that was like. And, you know, this is so normal to me now. It's been so normal to me for so long that this just feels like, you know, normal existence. So it's kind of nice because there's a sense that you settle into, you know, over time as this does sort of calm down and settle in. You settle into this just extraordinary way of being in the world. Were there any other key moments from the course that stand out for you, just out of curiosity, or maybe even key life moments that happened during the course?
Well, I think one of the things that happened during the course, I had been for quite some time contemplating retiring, and had really, you know, been pushing that out of my mind, not wanting to think about that, feeling all the excuses, you know. I'm too young to retire. I have too much left I need to do. You know, how will I survive after retirement? What will I do? And one of the decisions that came with the clarity was that it was the right time, that, you know, life was unfolding for me in a way so that it was time for me to move in a different direction. So that is one big change that has transpired through the course, and one that I'm still very excited and positive about, and just see great things in the future.
So now that you're retired, are you basically just sitting around bored?
Oh, not at all. I think the motivation that I feel now is such that there are some things that I've been wanting to do for a number of years that I've always made excuses, you know, too busy, too much this, too much that, and I'm able to be very clear about what I want to do with another number of things, and am starting to make some plans. Although I'm not planning too far in the future either. I'm waiting for things to unfold for me in the way I know they will, and I'm not worried about having to get things done in a certain order. There is motivation. There's not motivation to worry about things, which I think that was a lot of what I had in the past. I was very motivated to worry.
Why do you think you were motivated to worry? Because I think that's a very common thing, and I think that there's a pretty common set of answers to it, but I'm curious to see what you'll say.
Well, what I could say that that was the model I grew up with, and to some extent, really, I think that those were the patterns that I'd seen with my family, and possibly another thing I blamed my mother for. But I think I just felt so pushed all the time to make sure that everything was just right. I do tend to be on some level a perfectionist. Something I really never realized until a good friend of me told me that whenever I tried to do something, I always picked the hardest thing to do. I always had to be the best at doing it. So, those were things I'd always felt myself not to be that way. But so I did worry a lot because I felt like so many people were depending on me when I was depending on myself to be so perfect. That I really worried a lot about things that really I had no control over. But in thinking I had control over them, I just continued to worry that it had to be just right.
Absolutely. I think that's something that so many people can identify with. That's one of, I think, the most common ways and reasons that worry shows up. And I think a lot of people are this is going to be a little funny, but a lot of people are actually worried that if their worry went away, right, or their discomfort went away, or their anger went away, or their dissatisfaction went away, that their motivation would go away as well, that they wouldn't do anything, that they wouldn't get anything done, that they wouldn't accomplish or achieve or whatever anything. What do you say about that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's all part of our sense of self, is that we are so caught up in all those stories that we tell ourselves from the time we're able to think on our own, or other people are telling us, or what we see, that that becomes the overriding force in everything we do. And as that has become less and less important to me, and I've stopped believing a lot of those stories. I won't say they're not some that keep coming back at times, but I'm able to deal with that much more quickly now. But I really do believe that there is a fear that if we no longer have this, as bad as this is for us, or as bad as we feel, what do we have if we don't have that? But again, those things have all fallen away from me for the most part.
Well, a couple of things about that. I'd say the first thing is, when you say that when something like that comes up and it sort of passes away quicker, does that mean that it takes 6 months instead of 6 years to pass away, or is it an instantaneous passing away, or what do you mean by that? Say that.
I'll give you an example. Something that my daughter said to me recently, about how I did something, or poor girl has listened to all the stories I've told her all these years. But I was very annoyed by a comment she made, which referred to how I was at one time, or how I was always trying to be in control of everything, and whatever the situation was. That's another thing. See, it's at the point I don't even remember totally what it was now. But I remember, I felt annoyance about that, and then let's say an hour later, it was gone. I mean, I really, and it's not instantaneous for every situation, but I am able to, the feeling comes, and it's not as intense. I don't get that same level of anger about situations that I once did. But then I am able, within a couple of hours, it's totally as if it didn't happen. In terms of the internal feeling of anger that I used to have. So definitely not 6 months, and very quick, which is a wonderful thing. My mind goes back to feeling calm, and I'm able to just go on as if these little annoyances that would have lasted for 6 months didn't happen.
So I guess to paraphrase, it sounds like some things are really kind of instantaneous. There's a trigger, triggers you, and then it kind of falls away.
Right.
And then other things can take a little bit longer. But by comparison to what would have happened with those things before, they seem just incredibly short. They seem practically instantaneous because the timescales would just be so different before and now.
Absolutely.
But so much of that relates to conditioning, that unwinds. And I think it's really remarkable that a person can be in a place sort of psychologically or emotionally or however we want to think about it, that even the deepest, strongest triggers, those things that would have sent us previously reeling for, months, years even, some cases decades, there are things that people, that affect relationships and, just continue to snowball and grow inside of people for decade after decade. It's amazing. Those types of incredibly strong stimuli, it's remarkable how when they're triggered after this sort of fundamental shift occurs, they pass away so much faster. And I don't know if you've perceived this yet or not, but one of the things that I think is even more interesting about that is that kind of the more times that those things are triggered, the more rapidly they fall away from one time to the next. It's kind of, in your clinical life, it's kind of classical behaviorism. That whole stimulus response extinction thing that anybody that's had behaviorism and psychology is familiar with that. It seems to be essentially what's going on here. Without that former way of being, basically, without that previous sense of self that was all wound up in it and constantly fueling it, whatever, it seems to slowly kind of unravel and dissipate.
I agree. And I have experienced that several times now. As these things keep coming up, they don't seem to have the same power or strength as they once did.
Back to the other thing around goals and around motivation. What would you say to somebody who really feels like that sense of fear and that sense of worry and that sense of discomfort and all of those things that are often felt by people to be the driver in their life, to be so important, for them being able to accomplish what it is that they want to accomplish? What would you say to someone who says, listen, there's no way that I want to let go of those things? In the final analysis, oh great, you've got something that takes care of that. Keep that the heck away from me, because I've got all these things that are so important that I want to accomplish in my life. Has this transition, has the absence of those things and those things falling away meant that, sort of achievement or accomplishment or doing or motivation or however we want to think about this, I don't know, I'll leave you to talk about it. Does that fall away with it? Are you a lump on the couch? Or, what's going on? Just to circle sort of back around to that idea.
I think that rather than totally, causing you to feel no motivation, one of the things that I've noticed is that because I seem to have a greater sense of clarity about things, and because I'm not afraid of making the next step or trying the next thing to the same level that I once was, that rather than be less motivated, or I'm able to focus on the activity in the moment and be more productive. And without all of those worries that came to me beforehand about, you shouldn't do this, this is not, you don't have any talent, you can't be very successful. I'm able to get beyond those things and very clearly focus on things that I want to at least give a good try to. So definitely feel like that you can accomplish more if you get rid of all those old messages and all those old fears, and are able then to just focus very specifically on things that matter.
One other thing that I think is often heard as a concern from people as they think about this, there's something about this notion of such an extreme transition, and when I use terms like, well, there's a shift from a narrative, highly individualized sense of self to a whole other way of being. One of the things that people hear in that, I've learned, is something that's really quite terrifying, because they've really spent, I think we all have been through this, they really feel like they've kind of spent their entire life trying to hone this narrative, individualized sense of self, trying to make it happier, trying to get it what it wants to be happier, trying to get it in a position where it has a maximum amount of control over circumstances and in its life or whatever at any given point. And so I think there's this sort of terrifying idea. What do you mean that goes away? I've invested my entire life up to this point in building that thing, right? And so people hear about this shift, and it's just, I think, a terrifying thing for some people to contemplate that. And they're like, well, I don't hate who I am so much that I want it to go away. Or, on the other hand, maybe they're already quite happy. As you know, we had some very, very happy people in your class. And so, they might say, well, hey, hold it, I'm super happy already. I don't have any complaints necessarily, I mean, you can always maybe be a little happier. But I certainly don't want all of that to just go away. I don't want this shift where all of that just goes away. What would you say to people who have those concerns or who have those thoughts from your own direct experience or your own personal experience with this process?
The things that have gone away were all of the things that had accumulated throughout my life that really kept me from being who really the potential I think I have to be. And I hate to use those words so much, is because we keep talking about going beyond words. But the things for me that have fallen away are the things that held me back from understanding just how happy I could be, how good I could feel about life, about being in the world here and now. I don't see that there's anything that I've given up. Everything has just been enhanced. And that's the best way I can explain it, is that, all the good things are better, and the things that were just keeping me in more a feeling, a depth of anxiety and stress. Those things are the things that are gone. And I don't, I can't imagine ever wanting to go back to having, as we talked about, that God-sized hole in our soul that I had tried for 50 years to fill up, and it's gone. I don't feel like there's anything amiss now. I don't feel like situation that will happen that I can't handle. I just feel good about life and my place in it.
So even though you can understand that language that I use to describe this, it's not something to the transition away from a narrative self or from an individualized sense of self. It still doesn't. I mean, it's not. It's on the whole so positive and so additive, rather than even though it sounds like there's this loss. In reality, what's gained is so incredible. Is that a good sort of paraphrase?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's the positive so outweighs any possible. Again, I have a hard time thinking of anything negative. That my experience is that I would never want to go back to feeling the way I felt before. And
you're still, people still recognize you as Sherrie, and you're still Sherrie to them, even though more positive and not as snipey, right. Or whatever.
Good word.
So externally, I mean, people aren't saying to themselves, wow, who is Sherrie? Who is this person? I don't recognize this person. This is a totally different, what in the world is going on here? This is weird. There's nothing like that.
Right. I think I'm more pleasant to be around. Nobody wants to be around someone who can't see anything good about anything that's going on around them. And since I don't see a lot of those negative things, they just aren't important to me anymore. So everything is better.
In your mind, is there anything to fear at all around this fundamental shift?
I truly don't see anything to fear. I just I see things getting better. Again, for people who have known me, I'm still basically the same person I always was. I don't see that they don't see, I don't think that there's a huge change in my day-to-day interaction. But I feel so completely different in my outlook and in my view of dealing with relationships and just dealing with the world, that if the changes are only seen in me, then, or for me, then it's a good place to be.
For sure. And as you talked about earlier, even with your mom or with others, I mean, obviously those changes, they do naturally flow out. They do naturally have an impact in the world, which is, really awesome.
Yes.
Is there a religious or spiritual connotation to it? Is there a feeling of a divinity to it? Is there a feeling of everything being consciousness or conscious or aware or alive or something, or an aliveness or whatever to it? Whatever, I won't put words in your mouth. You've read all that stuff, of course, so it's not like I can bias you with this during this interview because you've read so much of it. But I'm just curious, in your own personal experience, how did that show up for you?
Well, I grew up in the Southern Baptist tradition, and over a number of years, I began to believe that organized religion may be the root of all evil. So I have very much drifted away to the point that, my thinking was more if, and I seriously doubted that there was a God. If there was, that he obviously, had no interaction of a positive nature with mankind. So I think that, again, was part of my anger and negativity. At this point, I have more a sense of connection between all that is, all that exists, whether that be, through nature, and of course that's very important to me. I feel like, that may be the root, that seeing the beauty of creation, but I do have a deep sense that we're all connected on a very fundamental level, and that connection exists throughout this planet and our existence, and extends out to all things throughout the universe. So that's sort of where I'm at right now.
I think that's about all the questions that I can think of. Is there anything that you can think of that you want to toss in? Anything come to mind?
One of the things that all of us talked about, and different folks experienced in different ways during the course, we talked about synchronicity, or those happy coincidences. And there have been a few of those experiences for me, and actually as I began to think over the last several months, I will be, I'll call someone up and they'll say, oh, I was just thinking about you. That happens a lot. Or someone calls me and I'm thinking about them. Or I'll start to say something to someone and they were getting ready to say the same basic thing to me. So I think, that's been an interesting experience, is that I feel like I'm more attuned to letting a lot of experiences happen, and a lot of those happy coincidences are beginning to take place, which has been, it's always exciting to just see what's going to happen next.
What goes along with synchronicity is sort of the idea of support from the world, kind of unexpected support from the world. Some traditions call it supportive nature, things like that, where it just seems like things are flowing differently than if we're in more of that narrative self that thinks that it knows what's right and thinks that it specifically knows exactly what it wants and is kind of trying to limit everything and put everything in boxes, even though it doesn't think it's doing that. It thinks that it's trying to expand the horizons or get sort of more and better whatever experience. Is there like a supportive nature sort of feeling to these synchronicity things that you're noticing?
I really think so. The biggest experience that I saw, which I feel like was that supportive thing, that happened shortly while we were still doing the class. There was a situation that arose and I needed $1,000. Had the opportunity to get something, and at the time I didn't have $1,000 just ready to whip out and spend. And I remember thinking that evening, well, I need $1,000. If it shows up, if I really do need this, then I'm sure I'm going to get it. And the next day, something occurred and I had the $1,000. I mean, we talked about releasing things during the course, and I thought about it and then just let it go, and it came back. So that was one amazing thing that happened, which I really directly, I mean, I don't see how, you know, those kinds of things don't happen to me or didn't happen to me. So I really see a direct relation to being able to just let go of worrying about things and expecting that those good things are going to come back to you.
Yeah, that's awesome. It is really interesting how stuff, it's just improbable stuff out of the blue. I hear you. That happens to me all the time.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the fundamental changes that with how I see the world and think about things is that previously I think I had this expectation that, you know, life was just ate you up and spit you out, and there, you know, no matter what you did, you just had to endure it. I had sort of settled into a place where I thought, you know, this is my lot in life, and it pretty well is not a very positive place, and I'll just have to endure. And I don't feel that way about what is coming to me from the world, from the whole experience. I really fundamentally see things in a much more positive way and expect that those positive things are going to come. So that's been very, very wonderful.
All right, anything else that you can think about?
I think that's pretty well it for now.
All right, awesome. So congratulations on becoming a finder. I think maybe one last thing to highlight might be people have heard you experimenting with other techniques and stuff since then. I suspect what you would say about it is not that there's some burning desire to fill that hole in you anymore, as we heard you mention earlier, but rather that, you know, life is fun and there's all kinds of stuff to explore and all sorts of ways to explore it, and why not explore it?
Exactly. And I think one of the things that you gave us was a number of techniques and encouraged everyone to find what worked and what was right for them. So perhaps, you know, getting a sense, you know, using my intuition to think this may be something that would have a positive effect, you know, has encouraged me to do a little more experimentation. So it's been a good thing.
That's awesome. And the experience, you know, I think it's important for everybody to know, is very tunable. I mean, there are lots of different ways that this can show up. And it all, you know, there's all that, the extraordinary well-being and that fundamental shift and that persistent shift and all that goes across all of it. But there are all kinds of ways to color it and play with it and experiment with it. And so certainly no reason not to, right? I mean, it's fun.
Exactly. And that's the big thing. Life is fun now. I wasn't experiencing that 6 months ago, but life is fun.
Not a bad way to ease into retirement. All right, on that note, thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking time. And I really appreciate, you know, all of the effort that you put in. Because it doesn't matter, you know, how good a protocol is or how working a protocol is. You still have to do it, and if you don't, you know, push through and do it, you can't really expect much to come from it. So I really thank you for both this great chat and for being willing to be open and help everybody out with their understanding of this, but also really for showing up in the course. And I look forward to you being able to translate this more and more for people over time, from your own personal experience to, you know, the others that want to have it happen for them, or just having it happen for them, and all of that. So thank you very much.
Definitely my pleasure. Thank you.
I'll see you again soon, I'm sure.
All right. Thank you so much.